say it. Call her ma'am." He whispered it like a threat. She looked at her children's faces, confused, ashamed, hurting. Then she looked at him, and she said it. One last time, because in 60 minutes a lawyer would walk through that door, and none of them would ever laugh again. At a Sunday dinner table with silverware clinking and laughter filling the room, while one woman sits in a chair that used to be hers and decides to stay silent one more time, not because she has nothing to say, but because she has learned through years of hard living that some truths do not need to be announced. They simply need to be protected, kept warm, held close, until the right moment comes to let them breathe. This is one of those stories. Her name was Adais, and she had a way about her that you could not quite name, but you could always feel. It was the way she moved through a room, unhurried, unbothered, like she was walking through a field she had known all her life and was in no particular rush to reach the end of. It was the way she listened when someone spoke, really listened, like what they said genuinely mattered, not performing attention, actually giving it. It was the softness in her voice when she called her children for breakfast, the steadiness in her eyes even when everything around her was anything but steady. She had that particular kind of grace that certain people carry, the kind that comes not from ease but from having survived difficulty and chosen deliberately not to let it make her hard. She was 36 years old. She had 2 children, a boy named Tobias, 11 years old, who had his father's jaw and his mother's patience and a quiet thoughtfulness that made him seem older than he was, and a girl named Neka, 9 years old, who carried herself with a dignity that was almost startling for someone so young, like she had been born already knowing something most adults spent their whole lives trying to figure out. Adaz had given them both the best of herself every single day without reservation. She packed their lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside, little messages, something encouraging, something funny, something that said, "I see you and you are loved." She attended every school event, every recital, every parent-teacher meeting. She made their home feel like a home. Warm meals, clean rooms, a porch where they could sit and talk, a mother whose arms were always open and whose voice was always gentle, even on the hardest days, even on the days when her own chest was full of something she had not yet found a way to release. She had built her whole life around love, around the quiet, daily, uncelebrated work of loving people well, and she had believed for a long time that it was always worth it. Her husband's name was Darnell. He was 40 years old. He had big hands and a confident walk and a laugh that could fill a room when he wanted it to. In the early years, the years that felt like a different life now, the years that Adazi sometimes pulled out of her memory like old photographs just to remind herself they had been real. That laugh had been the first thing about him that drew her in. He had been funny and attentive and warm in those years. He had told her on their second date that she was the most grounded person he had ever met. He had said it with an admiration so genuine that it had made her shy, and she had looked away smiling, and he had reached across the table and tipped her chin back up and said he meant it, that he had never known someone so rooted in herself. He had meant it then. She believed that, but somewhere between year 3 and year 8, something inside Darnell had shifted in ways that were slow at first, easy to excuse, easy to explain away, and then impossible to ignore. A promotion he had believed was his had gone to someone else. Then another. The career he had imagined at 30 had not arrived at 40, and the frustration he couldn't name had curdled into something that looked, from the outside, a lot like contempt, not for himself, for the person closest to him, for the woman whose groundedness he had once admired but had started, somewhere along the line, to resent. as if her steadiness were a judgment, as if her patience were proof of something he lacked and could not stand to look at. Rather than turning toward his wife when things got hard, he turned away from her, and then he turned toward someone else entirely. Her name was Felicia, and she had come into Darnell's world the way certain kinds of people do, all surface and certainty and the particular talent for telling a struggling man exactly what he needed to hear. She was loud in the way that some women are loud, always performing, always tracking who was watching, always dressed for an audience, even when the audience was just the two of them. She had taken hold of Darnell's ego first, and his heart second, and by the time Adaz had begun to sense that something in her marriage had gone quietly, permanently wrong, something deeper than an argument, something more structural than a rough patch, Felicia had already moved in so deep that Darnell could no longer see the difference between what was real and what was simply convenient. Now it was Sunday, the kind of Sunday afternoon that smelled like good food and felt like a lie. Adaz had been cooking since morning. She always cooked on Sundays. It was one of the rituals she had kept from her childhood, from those long Georgia afternoons on her grandfather's porch, when the smell of food meant safety and the sound of family meant belonging. Baked chicken rubbed with herbs. She grew herself on the kitchen windowsill, rice with stock instead of water, greens that had been slow cooking since before the children woke up, filling the house with a warmth that should have meant something. Cornbread still warm in the cast-iron pan. She had set the table carefully with the good cloth and the proper glasses, because Darnell's mother Loretta was coming, and Adaz had spent 8 years trying, genuinely, sincerely, without giving up, to find some peace with that woman even when that woman gave her none back. She had dressed the children. She had worn her good earrings. She had made the house as beautiful as it could be made. What she had not known, what Darnell had very deliberately not told her, was that Felicia was also coming. Darnell brought Felicia in through the front door like it was the most natural thing in the world. He made the introduction smoothly, the practiced ease of a man who had been rehearsing this in his head for a week. He introduced Felicia to Loretta as a close friend from work, and Loretta, who had spent 8 years treating Adaz with the particular coldness reserved for people you have already decided do not belong, smiled at Felicia the way she had never once smiled at her daughter-in-law, warm, open, like she had been waiting for this specific woman for a long time and was simply glad she had finally arrived. Darnell's 2 brothers, Marcus and Theo, shook Felicia's hand without missing a beat. Easy conversation, big smiles, like nothing about any of this required explanation. Nobody introduced Felicia to Adaz. Nobody seemed to think that was necessary. Adaz stood in the kitchen doorway and understood exactly who this woman was, the moment she walked through the front door wearing the same cologne as her husband. She recognized it instantly, the same scent that had been coming home on Darnell's shirt collar for months. She stood there for one breath, just one, and made the only choice available to her that still belonged entirely to herself. She chose not to fall apart. She breathed. She turned back to the kitchen. She plated the food she had cooked. She carried it to the table she had set, and she sat down in the chair closest to the kitchen because Felicia had already claimed her usual seat at the head of the table without anyone asking and without anyone saying a word to stop her. Nobody moved Felicia's plate. Nobody acknowledged the displacement. Darnell sat down beside Felicia and unfolded his napkin like a man settling into his rightful place. The dinner began with the surface calm of a lake, right before a storm moves in. Loretta made jokes and everyone laughed. Felicia spoke freely, too freely, as if she had been eating at this table for years rather than hours. She laughed loud at things that weren't funny enough to warrant it. She touched Darnell's forearm across the table in a way that was not accidental and was not meant to be subtle. She helped herself to seconds before Adaze had finished her firsts and commented on the food the way a guest comments on a hotel, appreciatively, but without any sense that someone she was looking at had spent the morning making it. Adaze kept her eyes moving between the food on her plate and the faces of her children. Tobias was quiet in the specific way that 11-year-old boys go quiet when they sense something wrong but don't yet have the language to name it. Jaw tight, eyes down, fork moving but not really eating. Neka kept stealing glances at her mother's face from across the table, reading it the way children read the faces of the people they love when they are trying to decide whether they should be frightened or not. Adaze kept her expression calm, not the performance of calm, the real thing, the thing she had built over years because she understood, with a clarity that had come at real cost, that showing emotion in that house only ever handed people weapons. The crack in the surface came 30 minutes in, ordinary and devastating. Adaze mentioned, quietly, that Tobias had a significant school presentation that Friday, something he had been working on for 3 weeks, something that mattered to him. She said she needed Darnell to leave work a little early so she could attend with him. It was a reasonable request. It was a normal thing to ask. She kept her voice light and steady and without any edge at all. Before Darnell could open his mouth, Felicia leaned forward across the table and said that Friday was not going to work, that she and Darnell already had plans. She said it conversationally, pleasantly, like the fact of her plans being on Friday was simply a piece of scheduling information that Adaze would of course want to know. The silence that dropped over that table was total. Adaze looked at Darnell, looked at him directly, waiting. Darnell laughed. He actually laughed. The short, dismissive laugh of a man performing confidence for an audience. He said Felicia was right. Said they had already made plans, and it wasn't something he could move. Said maybe Adaze could find someone else to go to the school thing, the way you might say someone else could run an errand. Loretta said, without looking up from her plate, "Things come up. You have to be flexible." And then she looked at Felicia and smiled warmly, like the two of them had an understanding that predated this dinner by some time. Theo looked down at his plate. Marcus reached for more cornbread. Neither of them said a word, no discomfort, no protest, nothing that acknowledged what had just happened in front of 2 children at their own dinner table. Adaze felt something move through her chest. Not anger. She was familiar enough with her anger by now to know when it was coming, and this was not it. Something colder than anger, something more final. The feeling of a door closing from the inside, not being slammed, just quietly, firmly pulled shut by someone who has made a decision they will not revisit. Under the table, Neka reached across and took her mother's hand, her small fingers curling around Adaze's without a word, just holding on. And then Darnell, emboldened by his mother's approval and his brother's silence and Felicia's easy presence beside him, by the audience he had assembled around that table and the performance he was clearly giving for all of them, leaned forward toward his wife. His voice dropped low, but not low enough that the table couldn't hear him. Each word careful, each word chosen, the words of a man who had been thinking about this particular moment for longer than just this afternoon. Say it, call her ma'am. No one at that table breathed. Adaze looked at Tobias first. His jaw was clenched the way it got when he was trying very hard not to cry. She looked at Neka, whose hand tightened around her fingers with a grip that said, "Please." She looked at Loretta, who was watching with the patient expression of someone who had helped arrange this moment. She looked at the brothers who were looking at their plates. She looked at Felicia, who was waiting with a small half-smile on her face that had nothing gracious in it at all. And then she looked at Darnell, her husband. the man she had loved when he was worth loving. She looked at his face, and what she saw there was not even cruelty exactly. It was satisfaction. He was satisfied. He was proud of himself. He had constructed this moment carefully, and he was enjoying the product of it. She thought, in the space between 1 second and the next, about a man with large, gentle hands who used to sit with her on a wooden porch in Georgia and watch the sun go down and say, in that slow, unhurried voice that she could still hear perfectly after all these years, the loudest one in the room is usually the most afraid. The quietest one is usually the most ready. She turned back to Darnell. She looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no tears, no begging, and no fear. Eyes that were simply clear, and she said it, softly, evenly, without any performance whatsoever. "Yes, ma'am." Felicia smiled wide. Loretta lifted her glass. Darnell leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who had just won something. None of them heard the phone vibrate on the kitchen counter. None of them saw Aday's glance at it once, from across the room, a brief flicker of her eyes, and see the name on the screen, Wellington and Associates, Estate Law. She turned the phone face down, went back to clearing the table, kissed her children after dinner, tucked them in with the same warmth she always carried, and then she sat alone in her kitchen in the quiet of a house that had stopped feeling like hers, and she held the brass compass pendant between her fingers, warm from her skin, smooth from years of being held exactly this way, and she breathed. She had already called them back. 3 days before this dinner she had called Wellington and Associates and spoken to a man named Marcus Wellington III for exactly 4 minutes. What he told her in those 4 minutes had rearranged something inside her that was never going back to where it had been. She said nothing. Not yet. She waited. To understand what Adaz was carrying, you have to go back to where she came from, past the Sunday dinner and the humiliation and the cold kitchen, past the years of marriage that had slowly dissolved into something unrecognizable, all the way back to red dirt roads and tall pecan trees and a wooden porch in a small town outside of Savannah, Georgia, where a little girl sat beside the greatest man she would ever know and received an education that no classroom could have given her. His name was Ezekiel. He was not the kind of man who announced himself. He was tall and broad and moved through the world with the deliberate slowness of a person who has no need to hurry because he already knows where he is going. His hands were large and worn smooth in the palms from decades of real physical work, not performance, not the theater of effort, but actual labor, building things, planting things, fixing what broke and improving what didn't need to break in the first place. He spoke rarely, but always precisely, and when he did speak, people did not talk over him. Not because he demanded silence, but because something in the quality of his attention made you want to pay him the same respect. He paid everything else. Adez's mother, Celestine, had died when Adeze was 5 years old, a sickness that came fast and took everything with it. One of those losses so complete that it reorders the whole shape of a child's world. Adeze had been old enough to remember the smell of her mother's kitchen, the sound of her voice in a certain high-ceilinged laugh, the warmth of her specific way of holding a child on her hip. Not old enough to hold on to much more than that. And so Ezekiel had raised her, without complaint, without drama, without a single moment in which he allowed her to feel like anything other than the center of his world. He had taught her things that no one else in her life would have thought to teach her. He told her about land, what it meant to own it, what it meant for your children that you owned it, what it had cost black people in this country not to own it across generations. He told her about patience as a strategy, not patience as passivity, not patience as tolerance of things that should not be tolerated, but patience as the deliberate management of time, knowing when to move, knowing when to wait. He told her that the loudest person in any room was almost always the most afraid, and that the quietest one, the one who sat still and breathed and watched everything while everyone else was busy performing, that one was usually the most ready. He had a small law firm out of Atlanta that he had worked with for over 40 years, Wellington and Associates. He had trusted them with everything. He said once that a good lawyer was worth more than any single investment, because a good lawyer protected all the others. He had also said that the most dangerous thing a person could do was to let the people around them understand the full extent of what they had built before the building was truly complete. Ezekiel had understood from very early on that visibility was a risk and that silence was sometimes the most powerful protective strategy available to a man who was building something that the world was not ready to celebrate alongside him. What Adaz had not known until a phone call 3 days before the worst Sunday dinner of her life, was the full scale of what Ezekiel had built. The land had multiplied. The early purchases in the 1960s, made with a courage that the times required and that most people would never fully appreciate, had compounded across decades into holdings across 6 southern states. The quiet investments in small companies that nobody around him had thought to look at had grown into significant private stakes. 50 years of patience, 50 years of the deliberate, unhurried management of time and money and opportunity, all folded quietly back into itself over and over, until the number that Wellington had read to her over the phone made her sit down on the kitchen floor. $35 billion left to her, unconditionally, irrevocably. The last time she had seen Ezekiel alive, he was 91 years old and small, in the hospital bed in a way that felt wrong for a man who had always seemed so permanent. He held her hand with both of his and looked at her face for a long time without speaking. Then he said, simply and completely, "Everything is taken care of, baby girl, everything." She had cried and held him and assumed he meant the house, the land, his modest savings. She hadn't asked what he meant. She had been too busy trying to memorize the feeling of his hands holding hers. He passed 3 weeks later, and the weight of what he had left, not just the money but the meaning, had been waiting for her ever since, patient as he had always been. After the Sunday dinner, the household began to deteriorate, with the slow thoroughness of something that has been rotting for a long time and has finally lost its last structural support. Darnell was gone 3 and 4 nights a week. He stopped pretending the excuses were true. He offered them with the flat exhaustion of a man who has decided that the performance of a lie is no longer worth the effort of selling it. Adaz stopped asking. She knew. She had known for longer than she wanted to admit. But knowing and naming are different things, and she had been careful with naming because she understood that once you say something out loud in a house full of children, it lives there forever. Loretta called twice a week with the particular skills she had developed over decades, the ability to deliver a wound inside a pleasantry, calling to ask about the children while finding, within 2 minutes, a way to tell Adaz that she needed to be more supportive of her husband, that a man with ambition needed a certain kind of wife, that Adaz had always been a little too wrapped up in herself. Adaz listened to all of it, said thank you, hung up, and sat with the steadily deepening understanding that this woman had never been her ally and was never going to be. The family meeting was the moment that made everything concrete. Loretta organized it, Darnell's brothers present. The stated agenda was finances, but the real agenda had been visible from the moment Adaz walked in and saw the way they were all sitting, already decided, already aligned. Loretta suggested that since Adaz had no financial contribution to the household, no income, no independent resources, nothing of her own, The house should be restructured under Darnell's name for clarity and protection. She said it in the smooth, reasonable voice of someone who has practiced the speech and believes the audience cannot see the seams. Darnell agreed without looking at his wife. Marcus nodded. Theo said it made sense. Adazi sat at that table with her hands folded and said absolutely nothing, not because she had nothing to say, because the house had been in her name since the day they signed the mortgage 8 years ago. A detail from the original application, a cleaner credit score, a better debt-to-income ratio, that had simply put her name on the title and that Darnell had never once in 8 years bothered to verify. She let them plan. She thanked them for their concern, and she went home and sat in her kitchen until midnight. That was the night she called Wellington and Associates back. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, she sat very still for a long time, and then she looked up at the ceiling of her kitchen, the ceiling of the house that had always been hers, and she said quietly to no one and to everything at once, "Okay, Grandpa." The formal gala for the reading of Ezekiel's estate was held at a downtown Atlanta event hall on a Thursday evening. Adazi had told no one. She dressed carefully, a simple black dress, low heels, the brass compass pendant worn outside her shirt for the first time, visible, no longer hidden. She kissed her children, told the sitter she would be back by 9, and left. She did not know that Loretta had been watching her more carefully than usual in the days since that family meeting, sensing something in Adazi's new steadiness that made her uneasy. She called Darnell that afternoon, told him to follow his wife, and so Darnell arrived at the event hall 20 minutes after Adaze, with Felicia beside him and Loretta on his arm, walking in through the same door with the combined energy of people who believe they have a right to be somewhere that they were not invited. The room held extended family members, distant relatives, a few figures from the community who had known Ezekiel in life. Most of them expected something modest, a house, some land, a careful distribution of a comfortable man's savings. There was polite conversation and the low hum of expectation set at a reasonable height. Adaze was already seated near the front. She heard the door open behind her. She did not turn around. Darnell spotted her and moved through the crowd toward her, already composing the public reasonable voice he used when he wanted to perform decency. He started toward the seat beside her. A member of Wellington's staff redirected him, quietly but firmly, to the seating in the back. Darnell sat. Loretta sat beside him, Felicia beside Loretta, the three of them arranged in a row in the back, with different versions of the same confused impatience on their faces. Attorney Marcus Wellington III entered the room, and the murmur dissolved. He was a tall man, dignified, measured, with the particular confidence of someone who has spent a lifetime managing things that genuinely matter and has learned to let that gravity speak for itself. He opened the leather portfolio in front of him and began. He started with history. He talked about Ezekiel the way people talk about someone they actually knew. Not a biography, not a performance, but a genuine accounting. The land in the 1960s, the courage that purchase had required, the decades of patient reinvestment and compounding, the holdings across 6 states, the private company stakes, the trust built with Wellington and Associates over 40 years of complete fidelity. The room was quiet at first, with the respectful quiet of people listening to a tribute. Then the quiet shifted. As the numbers began to surface, property values, portfolio sizes, the scope of what had been building quietly in the background of their lives for 50 years, the quality of the silence changed. Something tighter came into it, something breathless. Loretta leaned forward in her seat. Darnell's hands went very still on his knees. Wellington set down one page and picked up the next. He did not dramatize what he was about to say. He simply read it. The entirety of the estate, valued at $35 billion across all assets, properties, and holdings, is left unconditionally and irrevocably to my granddaughter. Dies. Complete silence fell over that room. Not polite silence, not respectful silence. The stunned, absolute silence of a room full of people whose understanding of the world they were sitting in had just been fundamentally restructured. Someone behind the middle rows made a small, involuntary sound, like air being pushed out of the chest. Loretta's grip found the back of the chair in front of her. Felicia took one slow step backward, then another. Darnell's mouth opened. Nothing came. Wellington then produced the second document. He explained it clearly. A legal protection clause prepared by Ezekiel in the final years of his life. After a series of quiet observations made during Adaise's last visits home. The clause was comprehensive, specific, and airtight. No spouse, by marriage, by claim, by legal action, by any instrument or argument whatsoever, could access, contest, attach to, or benefit from any portion of the estate. Ezekiel had seen what was happening to his granddaughter's marriage before she had been willing to name it. He had moved to protect her the only way he knew how, quietly, completely, and in advance. Darnell stood up from the back of the room. His voice, when it came, was high and strange, stripped of the confidence it usually carried, left with just the raw sound of a man whose floor had disappeared. He said Adaise's name, then again. He started forward through the crowd. Wellington's staff intercepted him, quietly, firmly. Adaise, for the first time since entering that room, turned around. She looked at Darnell, fully, without anger, without tears, without any of the visible devastation he might have expected from a woman who had been publicly humiliated in her own home just weeks before. She looked at him with eyes that were clear and calm and completely free, the eyes of a woman who has already done all of her grieving in private and has nothing left to perform for anyone. She held his gaze for 3 long seconds, then she turned back to the podium. Where do I sign? The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that real endings usually are, not the loud, dramatic confrontation that people imagine. No screaming in the street, no public reckoning, no final scene where everything that had been hidden finally gets said out loud. Just the steady, thorough dismantling of a structure that had already lost its reason to stand. Darnell's attorney called Wellington's office. The conversation was brief. The protection clause was untouchable. There was no angle, no argument, no legal instrument that could reach what Ezekiel had protected. Whatever Darnell had imagined was his to claim by proximity or marriage, or simply by being present in that room. It was gone before it had ever been real. He tried to speak to Adaise directly, came to the house that had always been in her name, a fact his attorney discovered with a particular kind of silence that would stay with Darnell for a very long time. He stood on the porch looking smaller than she had ever seen him look. She opened the door. She looked at him for a moment. She handed him a letter from Wellington and Associates outlining the terms of their legal separation. She closed the door gently, like she was handling something that no longer required force. Felicia was gone before the month ended. No dramatic departure, no confrontation. She simply stopped returning his calls one day and never started again. The scaffolding of what she had imagined, the proximity to something she believed was coming, had collapsed. Felicia was a practical woman. She moved forward without looking back. Darnell found himself in an apartment he could barely afford, with a career that had never recovered from years of stagnation, and a reputation that had quietly absorbed the details of what had happened in that event hall. Opportunities receded. People who had seemed close became harder to reach. He was not destroyed overnight. He was diminished in all the ways that matter and in none of the ways that can be argued against. Loretta faced something quieter and in some ways harder. The grandchildren, Tobias and Neka, had grown into their understanding of what had happened. Not from anything their mother said. Adazi never said a word against their father or grandmother in front of them. But children who have been watching carefully for years are not easily misled, and Tobias and Neka had been watching carefully for a long time. The warmth they had once given automatically to their grandmother grew careful, became conditional. Loretta had made choices, and the consequences of those choices arrived in the silence of a family that no longer gathered around her table. The brothers dealt with the legal fallout of the family meeting quietly and without making noise. There was nothing else to do. 6 months later, a new morning. The house had wide windows that let the Georgia light come in clean and full and unobstructed every morning, filling every room with something that felt like permission. There was a garden in the back that Neka had claimed entirely as her own. She had drawn careful plans in a notebook, planted things in deliberate rows, and approached the whole project with the kind of focused seriousness that made Adiz's chest ache with love and recognition every time she watched it. There was a porch that looked out over open sky and the tops of trees, and in the evenings, when the light went pink and gold, the way Georgia evenings do when they are feeling generous, it was the place the three of them ended up without planning it. Adiz did not make any dramatic announcements. She did not hold press conferences or give interviews or perform her wealth for people who had doubted her. She simply began to do the work, quietly, the way she had always done everything that mattered. The foundation had been incorporated 6 weeks after the estate transfer was complete. She had named it the Ezekiel Foundation, named for the man with the quiet voice and the large hands, and the pecan trees, and the 50 years of patience that had grown into something none of them had fully known how to imagine. The foundation focused on land ownership for black families across the South, on the very thing Ezekiel had begun in the 1960s with a single parcel of Georgia dirt and a particular kind of stubborn courage, on generational wealth education, on stable, dignified housing for families who had been told by every structure around them that those things were not available to people like them. It was not a vanity project. It was not a monument. It was the most direct way she knew how to keep faith with what he had built and what he had meant by building it. To take the thing he had done in private across 50 years and turn it outward, toward the community he had always quietly served. To let what he had planted in silence grow into something the people around him could actually feel. She had a team, people who were good at what they did and accountable to what the foundation stood for. She did not manage it like someone who had always had power. She managed it the way Ezekiel had managed everything, carefully, patiently, with her eyes on the long horizon rather than the short gratification. She still cooked every morning, still drove the children to school, still wore the same simple earrings, still tucked handwritten notes into lunch bags, still sat on the floor doing homework alongside Tobias when he needed help, still listened to Neka describe her garden plans with the full and genuine attention of a woman who has learned that the ordinary moments are actually the extraordinary ones. One evening, a Thursday, nothing special about it. She was sitting on the porch with Tobias beside her, doing homework, and Neka cross-legged in the garden below, making notes in her planning notebook with the focused intensity of a child who takes her projects seriously. The sky had gone that deep pink and gold over the tree line. The birds were doing the last of their evening business. The wind moved through the garden in a slow, warm way that felt almost deliberate. Adiz reached up and held the brass compass pendant between her fingers, held it the way she always held it, the way she had held it on a porch in Savannah when she was 9 years old, and her grandfather had first pressed it into her palm. It was warm from her skin. It was smooth from decades of being held exactly this way, in moments exactly like this one, when life pressed in and something needed to be remembered. She thought about Ezekiel, about the quiet certainty of him, about the way he had carried everything for so long and so invisibly that no one around him had understood the weight of it, until the weight was no longer his to carry and had passed entirely to her. She thought about what it meant that a man who had spent his whole life building something had spent his last years ensuring that what he built would land exactly where it needed to land, in the hands of exactly the person he trusted to know what to do with it. She thought about a Sunday dinner table where a woman had been told to lower herself in front of her own children. She thought about how small that room had felt, how heavy. She thought about how it had felt to say those two words with a calm she had not manufactured, because she had already known. She had already known that the moment she walked through the door of that event hall, the world those people had built around her would restructure itself completely. She did not feel angry about any of it. She had moved through the anger a long time ago, in the quiet of her own kitchen, alone, the way real things get processed. What she felt now was something more spacious, something she was still learning to inhabit, something that felt, on evenings like this one, like peace, not the absence of pain. Something better than that, the knowledge that the pain had not made her into something it wanted to make her, that she was still, after all of it, herself. She touched the pendant one more time, and she smiled, the kind of smile that does not need an audience, the kind that belongs entirely to yourself, to the private country inside you, where the people you loved continue to live and continue to speak. She sat at that table and endured what she endured, with a dignity that her opponents mistook for weakness because they had never learned the difference. She stayed standing long enough for the truth to arrive, and when it did, it arrived with 35 billion reasons why she had never needed a single one of their approvals. Some people will look at your silence and call it defeat. They will look at the way you absorb things without breaking and decide that you are someone who can be used. But a woman who knows what she carries, a woman who has been taught by someone great how to hold the real weight of real things without flinching, she never needs to prove herself to people who were never going to see her anyway. She just needs to stay standing. She just needs to hold the compass. She just needs to wait for the knock at the door. And when it comes, and it always comes, nothing in that room will ever be the same. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because every single day we bring you stories that remind you that your silence is not weakness. Your time is simply not yet, but it is coming. It is always coming. And when it finally arrives, nothing in that room will ever be the same again.